Hey everybody, Matt from Eastwood. When you're working on an old car, one thing that is difficult to get finished really nicely when you're working on your project is stainless trim. Stainless trim is something that oftentimes you have to send out to a professional shop to have done, and it can get costly really quickly. Today I'm going to show you a few quick tips that are going to help you repair your stainless trim and get you going so that you can save some money and get your project moving quicker. So let's get started. To do the majority of the work, we will only need hand tools. As you can see, this original 1950 stainless trim has years of door dings and parking lot abuse. I started by wiping the trim down with Pre to get a clean surface to work with. The Eastwood Trim Anvil is a key part of repairing delicate stainless trim. It can be bolted to the bench or clamped in the vise like we've done here. I started by flipping the trim over and using the blunt chisel end of the trim hammer to work out the dent in the trim. I always hammer lightly until I can hear the ring of the metal hitting the flat on the anvil surface. Filing the exterior of the trim highlights any areas that are still low and need to be hammered up. After each dent is mostly repaired, I move on to the next and repeat the process. On dents that are close to the folded edge of the trim, I use a small screwdriver, pry bar, or pliers to bend the tab or lip up just enough for me to get in there and hammer or chisel behind to knock the dent out. When needed, a small chisel or your flathead screwdriver can be used to get out light imperfections in tight areas where the hammer won't fit. I filed the damaged areas to check my progress as I go. I'm looking for the entire damaged area to be touched by the file to know that we've worked out most of the damage. On larger flat sections of trim, I use the Repuse Hammer to planish out any damage and follow up in the smaller areas with the smaller trim hammer. On areas where there is a gouge in the trim rather than a dent, I use a chisel to lightly tap the damaged area up. You may need to raise gouged areas up so they are a little higher than flush in order to hammer and file it smooth with the rest of the trim. Once all of the damaged areas are now filed smooth, I use a small section of a wooden stir stick as a sanding block with sandpaper to check the repaired areas more closely. As you can see, there is a very slight low spot in the trim where sandpaper did not contact the surface. This area is low and needs to be raised up. Continue to block sand and hammer the low spots up until the area sands out completely. I then used the DA sander and sanded the entire trim with 320 grit to get an even finish throughout. I worked my way up in grits and adjusted the damaged areas with my trim hammer when needed until I was at 1500 grit. These steps should take out the heavy scratches in the trim surface and get it ready to polish. Once I was happy with the condition of the trim, I applied stainless buffing compound to a tightly sewn buff wheel on the 1 horsepower buff motor. I proceeded to move the trim across the buff wheel slowly, keeping even pressure as I went. Be sure to only use the bottom half of the buff wheel to avoid damaging the trim. Repeat this process until you have an even shine in the trim with no scratches in the surface. I then switched to a loosely sewn buff wheel and applied white rouge to the wheel. I then followed the same steps, slowly moving the trim across the wheel until I had an even, brilliant shine to the surface. In the end, you will have a brilliant mirror finish that will be free of dents. This is a project that takes a lot of time, but the price of entry for the tools is quite low, and you will save a lot of money in just one project car. For all the tools that you saw in this video and more, make sure you visit Eastwood.com.